The cold morning wind cut through the streets of Los Angeles like a blade when Maria Rodriguez adjusted the scarf, tied firmly around her head, and pushed through the gate of the commercial building. It was 5:40 in the morning, and the last traces of dawn still clung to the air like an unfulfilled promise. Her worn sneakers squeaked against the wet floor of the entrance hall, each step echoing in the silence that precedes the awakening of a sprawling city. At 21, Maria carried on her thin shoulders much more than the faded knit sweater that had already belonged to 3 people before her. The smell of the overcrowded East LA apartment where she lived, a persistent mixture of open sewage, reheated frying oil, and humidity that never completely dried, had seeped so deeply into her clothes that even cheap soap couldn't remove it. It was a perfume of poverty that followed her like an invisible shadow, marking her presence in the corridors of TechGlobal USA before she even appeared. No one in the 16-story company had ever seen Maria smile. Her brown eyes, which could have shone like honey under the sunlight, always remained downcast, lifeless, focused on the floor she swept or the surfaces she cleaned. Her black hair, which she kept eternally tied in a tight and graceless bun, had never touched her shoulders in the workplace. She had become an expert in the art of invisibility, a shadow that passed between executive desks without disturbing the functioning of the corporate machine. What no one at TechGlobal USA could ever imagine was that Maria Rodriguez, the silent cleaning lady from the 12th floor, spent her free afternoons deciphering sacred texts in biblical Hebrew for pure intellectual pleasure. That she had developed over 6 years a genuine passion for ancient languages that relaxed her more than any common hobby, and that this apparently useless knowledge was about to save a $50 million empire. If you've ever experienced being underestimated because of your appearance or social position, leave a comment right now. This story will touch your heart in a way you never expected, but this revelation would still take a few hours to happen. On the 12th floor of the mirrored building, fluorescent lights hummed over the empty desks of the multinational data analysis company that processed information for companies in 16 countries. Maria knew every inch of that office. She knew that the financial sector printer always creaked on the 3rd sheet, that the marketing director left cookie crumbs scattered across his desk, and that CEO Edward Anderson drank exactly 3 cups of espresso before 10 in the morning, always accompanied by 2 antacid tablets. Edward Anderson was the type of man that business magazines loved to photograph. At 42, he had built a data empire from scratch, possessed the confident smile of someone who had never faced a significant defeat, and wore suits that cost more than Maria earned in 6 months. His offices had a privileged view of the city. His meetings decided the fate of millions of dollars, and his natural arrogance had grown proportionally to his financial success. What Edward didn't know was that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his business career. The discovery had begun completely accidentally on a rainy afternoon in 2017, when Maria was 15 and the world had collapsed on her family. Her father had just abandoned his wife and 4 children a week before Christmas, taking with him not only their meager savings, but also any illusion that things could resolve themselves. Carmen, Maria's mother, had cried so much that first night that the neighbors thought someone had died. In a certain sense, someone had indeed died. The version of the Rodriguez family that still believed in automatic happy endings. It was during a visit to the neighborhood Methodist church, looking for any kind of work that could help with household expenses, that Maria found the discovery that would change her life. In the back room, among boxes of donated clothes and used books, there was a study Bible different from anything she had ever seen. The cover was worn, some pages loose, but when Maria opened it, her eyes widened. It wasn't just a common Bible. It was an academic edition with detailed notes, Hebrew and Greek alphabets in the appendices, transliterated keywords, and explanations about the original texts that made her realize something fascinating. She was reading translations of translations of translations. How did Jesus really say this? Was the first question that sprouted in her teenage mind. What was the exact force of Paul's words when he wrote to the Corinthians? Curiosity was like a pleasant tingling in her brain. Maria took the Bible home and that same night began trying to decipher the first letters of the Hebrew alphabet. It wasn't an obligation, it wasn't a sacrifice. It was a delicious puzzle that made her forget family problems for a few hours. During the following months, Maria developed a ritual that would become her escape valve. Every afternoon, after school, and before helping Carmen with household chores, she would lock herself in the tiny room she shared with her sister Isabella and open her homemade notebooks. She used common paper and pen, nothing sophisticated, because she had discovered that writing by hand helped her memorize words and grammatical structures much more effectively than just looking. She started slowly, like someone playing. She copied the Hebrew alphabet dozens of times until the strange letters began to make visual sense. Then she moved on to simple words: father, mother, son, love, peace. Each new discovered word was a small victory that filled her with genuine pleasure. The free internet at the municipal library became her private university. Maria downloaded PDFs of basic biblical Hebrew and Koine Greek grammars, watched YouTube tutorials from seminary students and theology professors, and participated in online forums where students from around the world discussed translation and interpretation details. What began as teenage curiosity transformed into genuine passion. Maria discovered she had a mind naturally apt for languages. Complex grammatical structures, instead of frightening her, fascinated her. It was like solving a linguistic Sudoku every day, and each decoded text brought deep and relaxing satisfaction. At 17, when she had to abandon regular studies to work full-time and help support the family, Maria could already read complete passages from the Greek New Testament and understand basic structures of biblical Hebrew. What impressed her most were the nuances that were lost in translation, how a single word in the original could carry 3 or 4 different meanings, giving theological depth that Portuguese versions never captured. In her free afternoons, while other young women her age painted their nails or watched soap operas, Maria filled entire notebooks with verbal conjugations, grammatical paradigms, and vocabulary lists. She wrote and rewrote the same words until they became automatic. It was her secret hobby, her particular form of entertainment, as natural as other people watching series or playing video games. When she turned 21 and had spent 4 years working as a cleaning lady to support her family, Maria had developed a functional and surprisingly sophisticated understanding of biblical Hebrew. She wasn't a formal academic specialist, she had never set foot in a university, but she was a dedicated practitioner with broad vocabulary, especially in areas related to theology, literature, and abstract concepts. What she didn't know was that this apparently useless knowledge for a young woman from the barrio was about to detect a $50 million international fraud. The news had spread through the 12th floor like wildfire during Monday of that fateful week. During lunch break, some HR employees gathered near the coffee machine to comment about that situation with the morning shift cleaning lady. "We can't ignore it anymore," whispered Amanda, executive secretary for 5 years at the company, nervously looking around. "Yesterday I received 2 important clients who made faces as soon as they got off the elevator. One of them even asked if there was a problem with the air conditioning." "It's the smell," agreed Rebecca, receptionist who always maintained a respectful distance from Maria, as if poverty were contagious. "It's becoming impossible to work on the floor with her around." Yesterday, during the board meeting, Mr. Edward frowned and asked if something was spoiled in the ventilation system. "Someone needs to talk to her," suggested a third voice. "Maybe she doesn't even notice." "Talk how?" Amanda countered. "What are you going to say? Look, Maria, you stink." Poor girl, she seems like a decent person, but the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other employees, but the damage was done. By the end of the afternoon, a formal complaint had reached Edward Anderson's desk, signed by 7 employees, and characterizing the situation as detrimental to the professional environment and the company's image before clients. Edward, who had never exchanged more than 2 words with Maria Rodriguez in 8 months of her work at the company, made the decision without questioning or additional investigations. On Tuesday morning, he called HR with a clear instruction. The morning shift cleaning lady should be dismissed on Friday for issues of inadequacy to the corporate environment. Maria overheard the conversation by chance, hidden behind the copy machine while organizing cleaning materials. She felt the world collapse not for herself, but for the 3 siblings who depended on her $2,400 monthly salary. Junior, 18, had gotten a spot in technical school and dreamed of having a profession. Isabella, 15, studied with the goal of becoming a nurse. Diego, 13, was the smartest in the family and deserved a chance to develop his potential. Maria's salary as a cleaning lady was what paid the rent for the small two-bedroom apartment in East LA where they lived. Her mother Carmen worked as a day laborer, but earned little and had arthritis in her hands that limited her possibilities for heavier work. That night, Maria knelt beside the bed she shared with her sister and prayed like she hadn't prayed in a long time. She didn't ask for a miracle, didn't ask for wealth. She only asked for wisdom to know what to do with the next 3 days she had left. She couldn't imagine that the answer would come on a Tuesday morning through a video conference in Hebrew. "Maria, can you clean the conference room earlier today?" asked Rebecca on Tuesday morning without lifting her eyes from the computer screen. "Mr. Edward has a video conference at 9 with investors from Israel." Maria nodded and walked down the corridor, carrying the bucket with cleaning products and a cloth yellowed from use. Her movements were economical, silent. She had become an expert in the art of being invisible, a shadow that cleaned without disturbing. The conference room smelled of expensive leather and industrial air conditioning. Maria began wiping the imported mahogany furniture when she heard voices coming from the adjacent office. The slightly open door let fragments of a conversation happening through the state-of-the-art video conferencing system escape. "The data transfer protocols are exactly as we discussed," said Edward's voice in forced English with a heavy Brazilian accent. "Our American database will be fully integrated with your Tel Aviv servers by next Friday." Maria continued cleaning, half distracted, when a voice from the other side of the screen responded in a language that made her heart stop for a second. It was Hebrew, fluent, fast Hebrew, loaded with technical terms she immediately recognized due to her years of study. The man said in Hebrew, "Perfect. After the deal is concluded and the dust settles, we'll start transferring the information to our parallel project in Zurich." She approached the door, pretending to reorganize the cleaning products in the cart, and managed to catch more of the conversation. The men on the other side of the screen were discussing technical details about how to use the data collected by TechGlobal USA to feed a secret information bank that would be sold to competing companies in Europe. "SIP 27 BHWH MT Vargiem BK Chavanh BAVPN LAM Dvike," said a second Israeli voice. Section 27 of the contract was intentionally mistranslated, Maria understood with growing horror. The English version only talks about secure archiving for backup purposes, but the Hebrew text allows sharing for complementary research purposes and development of related projects. Low laughter from the other side of the screen. The first man continued in Hebrew, "These Americans will never understand what's happening. When they find out, we'll already have the $50 million and will have disappeared." Maria's blood froze in her veins. She was witnessing a gigantic international fraud, a scam that would not only cost $50 million to the company where she worked, but would also destroy TechGlobal USA's reputation in the international market. All employees would lose their jobs, including people who, like her, depended on that salary to support entire families. And she was, apparently, the only person in the entire building capable of understanding exactly what was happening. Maria finished cleaning on autopilot, her mind boiling with the moral dilemma that had fallen into her lap. On one hand, she would be fired in 3 days anyway. On the other, she couldn't sleep knowing she had allowed an injustice of this magnitude when she could have prevented it. That night, she knelt again beside the bed and prayed for guidance. Not for money, not for recognition, but for courage to do what was right, regardless of personal consequences. When she raised her head, her decision was made. On Wednesday morning, Maria arrived at work with her heart hammering against her ribs. She had spent the entire night thinking about how to approach Edward Anderson without sounding like a desperate person making up stories to keep her job. She knew she could be humiliated, expelled immediately, lose even the 2 days of work she still had left. But she also knew she couldn't look at Diego, her youngest brother, if she let $50 million be stolen when she could have prevented it. It was noon when she found the perfect opportunity. Most employees had gone out for lunch and Edward was alone in his office, reviewing contracts spread across the mahogany desk. Maria stopped in front of his door, the bucket of dirty water in her right hand, the damp cloth in her left, gathering all the courage she possessed. She took a deep breath and knocked on the door with her knuckles, 3 soft but determined knocks. "Come in," said Edward, without lifting his eyes from the documents, his voice carrying the automatic irritation of someone who doesn't like to be interrupted during important work. Maria pushed the door and took 2 cautious steps into the office. The contrast was striking. The smell of Italian leather and imported cologne that emanated from the environment versus the odor of disinfectant and poverty that accompanied her like a personal shadow. "Mr. Edward," she began with a trembling voice, the words coming out lower than intended, I need to talk to you about the contract with the Israeli company." Edward slowly raised his head, frowning with genuine confusion. It was literally the first time in 8 months that he looked directly at Maria Rodriguez. He saw a young woman too thin, with hair tied in a tight bun. That looked painful. Brown eyes that avoided direct contact, and a body posture that screamed social invisibility. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice loaded with incredulity. "You know something about the contract?" The tone already carried disdain. How could a cleaning lady know anything about international negotiations worth millions of dollars? "I know they're lying to you," Maria said, and for the first time in months, she raised her eyes and looked directly at Edward Anderson. "I heard them. Talking in Hebrew yesterday during the video conference. They're going to steal the company's data." Edward blinked twice, as if trying to process completely impossible information. "You speak Hebrew?" "Yes, sir," Maria replied, her voice gaining firmness as she realized he hadn't exploded in laughter or expelled her immediately. "I learned it myself, studying the Bible in the original languages. For 6 years." "This is completely ridiculous," Edward said, but his voice didn't have the conviction of someone totally certain of their own opinion. There was something in her seriousness, in the way she maintained eye contact despite obvious nervousness, that made him hesitate. "Mr. Edward," Maria interrupted, taking a step forward and lowering her voice to a more urgent tone. "Yesterday at 9:15 in the morning during the video conference, they said in Hebrew, 'Perfect. After the deal is concluded and the dust settles, we'll start transferring the information to their parallel project in Zurich.'" The silence that followed was so dense that Maria could hear the hum of the air conditioning in the ceiling and the distant noise of traffic 12 floors below. Edward looked at her as if she were an apparition, something absolutely impossible that had materialized in his office. "How did you—" he began, but couldn't formulate a complete question. His businessman's mind was racing, analyzing the implications of what he had just heard. "Mr. Edward," Maria said, gathering all the dignity she possessed, "I know you're going to fire me on Friday. I heard the HR people's conversation about complaints about my smell. I understand perfectly. I don't have hot water at home, sometimes not even cold water. I live in a neighborhood where sewage runs in the open and that smell sticks to clothes." Edward felt a pang of discomfort. Until that moment, Maria had been just an abstract administrative problem. Now, for the first time, he was seeing a real person with specific circumstances and her own dignity. "But I can't let you lose $50 million, Maria continued, "when I can help prevent it. It wouldn't be right." Edward stood up from his chair, his legs slightly shaky. In 20 years building his company, he had faced many unexpected situations, market crises, unfair competition, regulatory changes, but never anything remotely like this. "If what you're saying is true," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "You can easily verify it," Maria said with growing confidence. "Call the company's official translator. Ask him to review the video conference recording. Clause 27 of the contract is deliberately mistranslated. In Hebrew, it allows sharing for complementary research purposes and development of related projects. But in the English version, it only talks about secure archiving for backup." Edward sat down again, this time very slowly. "You read the contract?" "Yes, sir," Maria replied, allowing herself a shy smile. "When I finish cleaning early, sometimes there's time left over. I really like learning new things." And it was at that moment that Edward Anderson understood that he was facing something extraordinary, a brilliant mind hidden in circumstances that had prevented him from seeing it for 8 entire months. What he still didn't know was that he was about to meet not just a competent employee, but the woman who would change his life forever. An hour later, Edward's office was full of tension and people. He had cancelled 3 meetings and convened an emergency session with the company's official translator, Dr. Henry Morrison. a 52-year-old man with a PhD in linguistics and specialization in Semitic languages. Also present were Legal Director Dr. Jessica Williams, the IT manager responsible for video conference recordings, and 2 senior managers. Maria was sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, still holding the cleaning cloth in her trembling hands, watching while professionals with university degrees and 5-figure salaries confirmed word for word everything she had revealed. "My God," murmured Dr. Henry, taking off his glasses for the 3rd time in 10 minutes and cleaning the lenses with growing nervousness. "She is absolutely, completely correct in every detail." The IT manager had isolated the segments of the recording where the Israeli businessmen spoke in Hebrew, and Dr. Henry translated them aloud while everyone listened in shocked silence. "Here, they say in Hebrew, 'Perfect, after the dust settles, we'll start transferring the information to our parallel project in Zurich,'" Dr. Henry continued, adjusting his glasses. "And in this part, Jesus Christ, they're literally laughing and saying, 'These stupid Americans will never understand what's happening.'" "And Clause 27? Asked Dr. Jessica Williams with a tense voice. "Intentionally mistranslated," Dr. Henry confirmed, shaking his head. "The difference is subtle in translation, but gigantic in legal implications. In the English version, it seems we're just creating secure backups. In the original Hebrew version, we're literally giving permission for them to use our data in any related project they want to develop." Edward leaned back in his chair, his face pale. "If we had signed this contract, we would have lost not only the $50 million from the initial investment," Dr. Jessica Williams completed, "but we would also face lawsuits from all our clients for privacy violations. This could completely destroy the company." A heavy silence took over the room. Everyone present simultaneously understood that they had avoided a financial and legal catastrophe by pure luck, and thanks to the unexpected competence of a cleaning lady who was about to be fired for hygiene issues. Dr. Henry turned to Maria with an expression of genuine respect and professional curiosity. "May I ask where you learned Hebrew with this fluency?" "Actually," Maria replied shyly, "I studied it myself. I started at 15 using a study Bible I found at a church. I always wanted to understand the exact words that Jesus and the apostles used." "By yourself?" Dr. Henry widened his eyes. "You developed this proficiency in biblical Hebrew through self-teaching?" "Yes, sir. I use notebooks and common paper, write the words several times until I memorize them. It's relaxing for me, like other people do Sudoku." Dr. Henry looked at Edward with an expression that mixed incredulity and admiration. "Edward, do you have any idea what just happened here? This young woman detected a sophisticated linguistic fraud that I myself could have missed if I weren't specifically looking for it." Edward stood up and walked to the window, observing the city's movement below. When he turned to Maria, his expression had completely changed. The irritation and disdain had been replaced by something she had never seen directed at her, genuine respect. "Maria," he said, and for the first time in 8 months he pronounced her name with real dignity, "you just saved my company." But Maria, with her conservative upbringing and natural caution, wasn't prepared to accept praise easily. "I just did what I thought was right," she replied, lowering her eyes again. "Anyone would do the same thing." "No," Edward said firmly. "Not anyone would have the linguistic competence to detect the fraud, nor the moral integrity to report it even knowing they would be fired. You did much more than your obligation." What Edward still didn't fully understand was that he was talking to a young woman whose values had been shaped by years of adversity, genuine faith, and a home education that prioritized character over convenience. Maria hadn't saved the company expecting a reward. She had done it because her conscience wouldn't allow silence in the face of injustice. And this discovery about her character was about to impact Edward Anderson much more deeply than mere financial gratitude. On Thursday morning, Maria arrived at work expecting to find an early dismissal letter on her cleaning materials table. Instead, she found an elegant envelope with her name written in careful calligraphy, accompanied by an amount of money she had never seen gathered in her life, $1,500 in new bills. Inside the envelope was a card with company letterhead. "So you can buy personal hygiene products and some appropriate clothes before our conversation today at 2 p.m. With admiration and deep gratitude, Edward Anderson." Maria read the card 3 times, trying to process the reality. It wasn't a loan or salary advance. It was a gift, offered with the kind of delicacy that took her personal dignity into consideration without turning the situation into humiliating charity. For the first time in months, she smiled. At 2 in the afternoon, Maria knocked on the CEO's office door wearing new jeans, a simple white blouse and clean sneakers. She had taken a long shower in the women's locker room at the company, washed her hair with shampoo from reception, and looked at herself in the mirror for the first time in years without feeling automatic shame. "Please come in," Edward said, gesturing for her to sit in a leather armchair in front of the desk. "First, Maria, I need to formally apologize to you." Maria settled into the chair, still not quite believing that this conversation was happening. "You don't need to, Mr. Edward." "I do," he interrupted firmly. "I was going to fire you out of pure prejudice, over a complaint about something you couldn't control living in the circumstances you live in. I judged you by appearance for 8 months, without ever bothering to get to know the extraordinary person who worked in my own office." "You couldn't have known," Maria replied, demonstrating the genuine humility that had become her second nature. "I could have asked," Edward said, his voice loaded with real guilt. "I could have talked to you at some point. I could have treated you like a human being instead of an invisible employee." He stood up and picked up a folder from the desk. "I'm going to make 3 offers, and you choose which one you prefer. But first, you need to understand, this isn't charity. It's recognition of competence and an attempt to correct an injustice." Maria felt her heart accelerate. "What kind of offers?" "First option," Edward began. "You remain as a cleaning lady, but with a salary of $6,000. Monthly, complete family health plan, and I personally guarantee that your family has a better house in a safer area within 3 months." Maria's eyes widened. It was more money than she had dreamed of earning in her entire life. "Second option," Edward continued, "I put you in our professional training program. 6 months studying intensive English, business administration, and international relations, with full scholarship and salary of $4,000 during the study period. Afterwards, you take on the position of assistant in the international department with starting salary of $10,000. Maria was speechless, but Edward still hadn't finished. "Third option," he said, and for the first time since she had entered the office, he smiled genuinely. "The company has a strategic meeting in Tel Aviv next month with new Israeli partners, obviously different from the fraudsters. We need someone who speaks fluent Hebrew to ensure there are no more misunderstandings. Would you be willing to travel to Israel as our linguistic consultant?" "Israel?" Maria whispered, and Edward immediately noticed that her eyes shone with an intensity completely different from any reaction he had seen when mentioning salaries or promotions. "I've always dreamed of visiting the Holy Land," she said with her voice choked with emotion. "Walking where Jesus walked, seeing the places I've studied all these years." Edward observed her reaction with growing fascination. Most people would be ecstatic with salary offers of $10,000. Maria, however, had genuinely gotten emotional only when he mentioned Israel. It wasn't financial ambition that moved her. It was something much deeper and more authentic. "But I can't leave my family alone," Maria continued, practicality overlaying emotion. "My mother has arthritis. My siblings depend on me. How will they manage while I'm away?" "I've already thought of that," Edward replied. "If you accept the third option, the company hires your mother as a temporary employee on the cleaning team with a decent salary, provides medical care for her arthritis, and ensures your siblings have everything they need during your absence. You'll return to a permanent job as international relations specialist, with starting salary of $16,000 monthly." Maria was silent for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly. It was an offer that would change not only her life, but the destiny of her entire family. At the same time, there was something inside her, formed by conservative values and natural caution, that made her hesitate before such drastic changes. "Mr. Edward," she said finally, "may I ask why you're doing all this? I just did what I thought was right." Edward leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "Exactly because of that. Because you did what was right without expecting reward. Because you have exceptional competence that you developed out of pure passion, not ambition. And because," he hesitated, looking for the right words, "because you showed me that I had become the type of person who judges books by their covers. So," he continued, "do you accept traveling to Israel?" Maria took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment. Edward noticed she was praying silently, and when she opened them again, there was a serene determination he had never seen. "I accept," she said, "but with one condition." "Which one?" "If I really do well. On this trip, if I manage to help the company as you expect, I want to create a program for young people like me. Children from poor families who want to learn languages but don't have the opportunity. Not charity, opportunity. Teaching through passion, like I learned." Edward extended his hand to Maria with a smile she perceived to be completely genuine. "Deal." "And Maria?" "Yes? You can call me Edward. We're partners now." 2 weeks later, at Los Angeles International Airport, Edward was checking travel documents when a stunning woman approached the airline counter next to his. Black hair, long and straight, falling naturally over her shoulders, moving with a discreet elegance that drew attention without effort. When she turned slightly, he could see honey-colored eyes that shone under the airport lighting, and a genuine smile that illuminated delicate features that seemed sculpted. Edward wondered who this elegant woman could be, clearly an executive or international consultant, and why she seemed vaguely familiar to him. "Mr. Edward," said a hesitant voice behind him. He turned around and found himself face to face with the same woman he had admired moments before. His brain took several seconds to process the impossibility. It was Maria Rodriguez. The shy cleaning lady who always kept her eyes down had transformed into the most beautiful woman he had seen in months. "Maria," he said, genuinely shocked. Wow, you look completely different." She blushed, slightly, a natural flush that enhanced the clear skin that had been hidden under years of fatigue and forced neglect. "The company paid for a personal stylist," she explained modestly. "Appropriate clothes, a professional haircut. I never imagined I could look like this." What Edward was seeing wasn't just the result of expensive clothes or professional makeup. It was Maria being allowed, for the first time in her adult life, to express her natural beauty. The hair she always kept, tied in a painful bun, was naturally straight and shiny. The eyes she always kept down were expressive and intelligent. The smile she rarely allowed herself revealed perfect teeth and genuine joy that completely illuminated her. "It's not just the clothes," Edward said, still processing the transformation. "You look radiant, confident." "For the first time in my life," Maria admitted, "I feel like I have permission to be myself." During the 11-hour flight to Tel Aviv, Edward discovered that the transformation went far beyond physical appearance. Maria talked about Middle Eastern international politics with impressive knowledge, discussed cultural nuances that could impact negotiations, and demonstrated sophisticated understanding not just of languages, but of how language and culture intertwine in international business. "How do you know so much about Israeli geopolitics?" asked Edward as they flew over the Atlantic Ocean. "When you study biblical Hebrew," Maria explained, "you automatically become interested in the region's history. And when you become interested in history, you start following current events. I read news in Portuguese, English, and Hebrew. Sometimes the same news has completely different angles depending on the source." Edward realized he was talking not just with a competent translator, but with a sophisticated analytical mind that had developed completely self-taught. The woman sitting next to him on the plane was living proof that exceptional intelligence can flourish in any circumstance, waiting only for the right opportunity to manifest. What he still didn't know was that this discovery was planting the seeds of feelings much deeper than professional admiration. The first meeting took place at the David Intercontinental Hotel in the heart of Tel Aviv, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. Edward was nervous. After the traumatic experience with the previous fraudsters, every new Israeli partnership seemed like a potential minefield. Maria, however, was in her element. When the Israeli businessman from TechVision began discussing technical details in Hebrew, she took control of the situation with a naturalness that surprised even Edward. She not only translated every word perfectly, but also captured cultural and linguistic subtleties that professional translators frequently miss. "Wait," she said fluently in Hebrew, interrupting a technical discussion. "I want to understand something about data security." The Israelis stopped talking and looked at Maria with genuine surprise. Not just because of her linguistic fluency, but because of the naturalness with which she participated in the discussion as an equal, not as a mere translator. Avraham Cohen, CEO of TechVision, said in Hebrew, "You speak Hebrew at the level of a native speaker. Where did you learn?" Maria replied, smiling, also in Hebrew, "I learned it myself, out of love for the language and culture." What followed was one of the most successful business meetings Edward had ever witnessed. Maria didn't just translate. She interpreted cultural contexts, explained religious nuances that influenced business decisions, and demonstrated an understanding of the Israeli mentality that impressed even the natives. "She's not just a translator," Avraham said to Edward in English after 2 hours of negotiations. "She's a true cultural bridge. You're lucky to have found someone like that." "We're the lucky ones," Edward replied, looking at Maria with growing admiration that was beginning to transcend purely professional boundaries. That night, after a successful business dinner, Edward invited Maria to walk through the ancient streets of Jaffa. "How do you feel?" he asked, as they watched the golden sunset over the Mediterranean Sea. "Like I've come home," Maria replied, her eyes shining with pure happiness that Edward had never seen in any person. "I spent so many years studying about this place, dreaming of stepping on this land. It's as if all the hours of study, all the difficulties were worth it just for this moment." "And about work, about the change in your life?" Maria was silent for a moment, watching the waves break against the ancient stones of the port. "You know what impresses me most," she said finally. "It's not the new salary, it's not the beautiful clothes or the trip. It's the respect. It's realizing that people listen when I speak, that they value my opinion, that they treat me as if I had something important to contribute." "You always had it," Edward said softly. "The difference is that now you have the opportunity to show it." "No," Maria shook her head. "The difference is that now I found people willing to see." Edward felt something move inside his chest, an emotion he couldn't completely identify, but that had to do with admiring not just Maria's professional competence, but the integral and resilient person she was. For the first time in his life, he was in the presence of someone who had earned respect through pure character, not status or money, and this discovery was affecting him much more than he had imagined possible. 6 months had passed since the trip to Israel, and TechGlobal USA had become a reference in the international data analysis market, largely due to Maria's exceptional work as international relations specialist. She had completed the training program with the best grades in the company's history, learned English in record time, and become one of the corporation's most valuable employees. Edward watched this transformation with growing admiration and gradually with feelings that began to transcend the purely professional sphere. What impressed him most wasn't Maria's linguistic competencies, although they were extraordinary, but her unshakable integrity. In 6 months of working together, he had witnessed countless situations where she could have taken advantage of her privileged position or courted special favors. Instead, she continued being the same humble person focused on doing the job well. On a December morning, Edward knocked on Maria's office door. She now had her own office with a view of the city, with a proposal different from all the previous ones. "Maria, do you have a minute?" "Of course, Edward," she replied, lifting her eyes from the contract she was reviewing. Even after months working together, she still maintained a respectful formality that he had learned to interpret not as coldness, but as her natural way of establishing healthy professional boundaries. "I want to invite you for coffee," he said, and immediately clarified, "Not about work, about us." Maria blinked, genuinely surprised. "Us? Maria, we spend almost 8 hours a day working together for 6 months. We've traveled to 3 countries, closed important deals, built a solid professional partnership, but I realize I still don't really know you as a person." She hesitated, and Edward could see natural caution appearing in her eyes. "Edward, our professional relationship is very important to me. I don't know if it would be appropriate." "Coffee," he repeated softly, "as 2 people who respect each other mutually and who could get to know each other better as human beings. No pressure, no expectations." Maria studied him for a long moment. Edward had learned to recognize that expression. She was evaluating the situation through the conservative values and caution that had guided her through a lifetime of difficulties. "Just coffee," she said finally. "And we talk about work too." Edward smiled. "Deal." The first coffee happened on a Friday afternoon at a small establishment near the office that served natural sandwiches and had a welcoming atmosphere without being too romantic. Edward discovered that Maria, besides being intelligent and competent, had a subtle sense of humor and a life perspective that fascinated him. She talked about her siblings with genuine pride. Junior had gotten a job in the technical area and was dating a classmate. Isabella had entered nursing school. Diego, now 15, was excelling in mathematics and talked about studying engineering. "Your mother must be very proud," Edward commented. "She says she doesn't recognize her own life," Maria smiled. "After years of struggle, now she can treat her arthritis, lives in a house with a yard, and sees her children studying. Sometimes she cries from happiness." "And you? Are you happy?" Maria considered the question. "Seriously, I'm grateful," she said finally. "I learned the difference between happiness and gratitude. Happiness comes and goes. Gratitude builds a solid foundation for life." Edward found himself thinking about this conversation throughout the weekend. The second coffee happened 2 weeks later. This time Maria talked about her faith, not in an evangelical or imposing way, but as someone who had found deep meaning through solid values. "Have you ever thought about formal theology?" Edward asked. "With your knowledge of biblical languages, I think about it sometimes," Maria admitted, "but I don't want my passion for knowledge to become academic obligation. I like studying for pleasure, at my own pace, discovering things that genuinely interest me." The third coffee was when Edward understood he was falling in love. It wasn't a dramatic moment. Maria was talking about a project she wanted to develop, a cultural exchange program between American and Israeli youth focused on breaking prejudices through language learning, and Edward realized he wasn't just listening to her words, but observing the way her eyes shone when she talked about making a difference in other people's lives. That's when he understood he admired not just her intelligence or competence, but the complete person she was, integral, generous, resilient, and deeply committed to values that went far beyond material success. The problem was that Maria, with her natural caution and conservative values, didn't seem open to relationships that mixed personal and professional life. Every time Edward tried to take a step beyond respectful friendship, she gently redirected the conversation to safe topics. Edward understood that winning Maria Rodriguez's heart would be very different from everything he had experienced before. It wouldn't be a matter of impressing her with power or money. It would be a matter of proving, through consistent actions over time, that his feelings were genuine and that he respected both her values and her autonomy. And for the first time in his life, Edward was willing to make this long-term emotional investment. The following autumn brought a series of proposals that tested the limits of the professional relationship between Edward and Maria. "How about we have dinner to discuss the Jerusalem project?" Edward suggested one afternoon after a particularly successful meeting. "We can discuss it here in the office on Monday," Maria replied. Diplomatically, "I have all the documents organized. A classical music concert at the Walt Disney Concert Hall. I know you like culture." "Thank you, Edward, but I prefer to keep our relationship in the professional sphere." "A business trip to Buenos Aires? The Argentine company that wants partnership speaks a lot of Spanish mixed with Hebrew. If it's necessary for work, of course, but I travel as a company employee with separate accommodation and strictly professional agenda." Edward began to understand that Maria had established clear boundaries, not out of disinterest but out of principle. She had grown up in a family where serious relationships were built on solid foundations of mutual respect and shared values. For her, mixing personal and professional life without clarity about serious intentions was inadmissible. The turning point came in a casual conversation during a meeting with the marketing team. "Maria," said Amanda, the executive secretary who had been one of the people to complain about her smell a year before, "you never talk about personal life. Do you have a boyfriend?" "No," Maria replied simply. "But why? You're beautiful, intelligent, successful." Maria smiled with the patience of someone who had answered this question many times. "Because I haven't found someone who shares my values and who is looking to build something serious and lasting." "What kind of values?" Amanda insisted, genuinely curious. "Faith, family, commitment. I believe in marriage as a partnership for life, in building a family based on love and mutual respect. I'm not interested in casual relationships or people who don't know what they want from life." Edward, who was present at the meeting, felt as if Maria had just drawn a clear map of what would be necessary to win her. It wouldn't be enough to admire her or show romantic interest. It would be necessary to prove that he shared her fundamental values and that he was genuinely interested in a life partnership, not a passing adventure. And for the first time in his 43 years, Edward Anderson was willing to re-evaluate his own priorities to become the type of man who would deserve the love of a woman like Maria Rodriguez. The change began gradually. Edward, who had always been focused exclusively on business growth and financial success, began to question whether there were other ways to measure a well-lived life. He started attending a church near the office, not from sudden conversion, but from genuine curiosity about what shaped Maria's values. He began reading about healthy relationships, about building solid families, about the difference between temporary passion and lasting love. 6 months after starting this journey of self-discovery, Edward asked for a private conversation with Maria. "Can I ask you a personal question?" he said, sitting in the chair across from her desk. "Depends on the question," Maria replied with her usual caution. "What would it take for you to consider a serious relationship with me?" The question was so direct and honest that Maria was genuinely surprised. She had expected more persuasion attempts, more invitations disguised as professional opportunities. She hadn't expected raw vulnerability. "Edward," she began. "You don't need to answer now," he interrupted. "But I want you to know that I've spent the last months thinking about the kind of life I want to build, and more I imagine this life alongside a woman who challenges me to be a better person. A woman like you." Maria studied him for a long moment. "Are you sure you're not confusing professional admiration with love?" "I am," Edward replied without hesitation. "I admire your competence, but I fell in love with your character, with the way you treat your family, how you maintain your principles even when it would be easier to give them up, how you find genuine joy in helping other people." "Edward," Maria said softly, "you know I'm not the type of woman who accepts casual relationships, right? If I consider a relationship with you, it will be because I believe we can build something for life." "That's exactly what I want," he replied. "I want to build a family with you, Maria. I want to be the kind of husband and father you would respect. I want our children to grow up seeing a relationship based on genuine love and solid values." It was the first time in over a year that Edward saw Maria completely speechless. You're talking about marriage?" she asked finally. "I'm talking about true commitment, about building a life together based on respect, love, and shared values, about becoming the kind of man you would choose as a partner for life." Maria closed her eyes for a moment. Edward already recognized this gesture as a sign that she was praying silently. When she opened them, there was a tenderness he had never seen directed at him. "Do you have any idea how much you've changed in the last year?" she asked softly. "I changed because you showed me there were better ways to live," Edward replied. "You taught me that real success isn't measured only by numbers in a bank account." "Edward," Maria said, and for the first time, she spoke his name with genuine affection instead of professional formality. "I would very much like to get to know you better as a person. Not as a boss, not as a work partner, but as a man I can trust with my heart." "That's all I want," he replied, extending his hand to her. Maria hesitated only a moment before accepting his hand. "But let's go slowly, okay? I'll need time to be sure our values really align." "All the time you need," Edward said, and for the first time in over a year, Maria Rodriguez smiled at him with complete and unreserved joy. The following 6 months were different from any romantic experience Edward or Maria had lived before. Edward courted Maria with the patience of someone who had understood that true love cannot be rushed. Occasional flowers, never exaggerated, accompanied by handwritten cards with genuine thoughts about specific characteristics of hers that he admired. Invitations to activities that respected her values, classical music concerts, theater plays, walks in parks where they could talk without pressure. Maria, in turn, gradually allowed herself to open her heart to someone who had proven, through consistent actions, that he respected both her boundaries and her dreams. The first kiss happened on a spring night, after a sacred music concert where they had heard Bach compositions based on biblical texts. Edward had made an intelligent comment about how the composer used harmonic progressions to reflect the theological content of the lyrics, demonstrating that he had really dedicated time to understanding things that were important to Maria. "How do you know so much about sacred music?" she asked as they walked through the parking lot. "I spent months studying," Edward admitted. "I wanted to understand the things that make you happy." That's when Maria understood that Edward had done exactly what she did with Hebrew. He had studied out of love, not obligation. He had dedicated himself to knowing her inner world because he genuinely wanted to share it. She turned to him under the soft light of a lamppost and, for the first time, initiated physical contact. She placed her hand on his face and said, "You've become exactly the kind of man I could love forever." The kiss was soft, respectful, loaded with promise more than passion. 3 months later, during a business trip to Jerusalem, the first time they returned together to the Holy Land, Edward asked the question he had carefully planned. They were in the old city near the Wailing Wall when he knelt on a small stone he had kept from their first visit together. "Maria Rodriguez," he said, opening a small box with a simple but elegant ring, "will you accept building a family with me based on love, respect, and the values we discovered we share?" Maria began to cry, tears of pure joy that shone like crystals under Jerusalem's golden sunset. "Yes," she said, extending her trembling hand. "Yes, I accept." The wedding took place a year later, in a simple but deeply meaningful ceremony at the Methodist church in the neighborhood where Maria had grown up, the same place where she had found the study Bible that changed her life. Maria's mother, Carmen, radiant with pride and completely cured of arthritis after medical treatments, cried with happiness. Junior, Isabella, and Diego were in the front rows, witnessing their older sister achieve the kind of happy ending they had dreamed for her during years of difficulty. Edward had insisted on a bilingual ceremony. Maria said her vows first in English, then in Hebrew, and the entire congregation was silent with emotion, hearing the melody of the ancient language echo through the walls of the humble church. She said in Hebrew, "I have loved you since the moment I discovered that true love is built on mutual respect and not on external appearance." Edward, who had studied basic Hebrew during their engagement to be able to understand at least some of the most important words, responded with a heavy accent but sincere heart, also in Hebrew. "And I learned from you that true wealth is loving and being loved by a good woman." The house in Manhattan Beach had a garden where Maria cultivated aromatic herbs and an office she had transformed into a library with texts in Hebrew, Greek, Portuguese, and English. Edward arrived from work every day at 6 o'clock sharp, a radical change for someone who used to work until 10 at night, to have dinner with his wife and plan the future of the family they were building. TechGlobal USA had become an international reference in data analysis, with offices in 5 countries and Maria as Director of International Relations. But the project that made her proudest was the Seeds of Knowledge program, which had already benefited more than 300 American children with full scholarships to learn languages. "How did you achieve this?" asked Rebecca Silva, a 16-year-old girl from East LA who had learned Arabic studying with Syrian refugee neighbors and had now been accepted at a university in Lebanon to study international diplomacy. They were at the airport saying goodbye to a group of 20 young people who had spent 6 months studying in Israel through the program Maria had created. "I didn't achieve anything. Alone," Maria replied, hugging the teenager. "I had the blessing of finding people who knew how to see beyond appearances and gave me an opportunity. Now it's my responsibility to create the same opportunities for other people." "But how did you know it would work?" Maria smiled, remembering herself at 16, full of dreams, but without visible paths to achieve them. "I didn't know, but I learned that we don't need to be certain about the entire future. We just need to take the next right step and trust that God has a bigger plan." That night at home, Edward found Maria in the garden, reading a letter that had arrived from her family. "News from the family?" he asked, sitting next to his wife on the rocking chair they had bought for the terrace. "Wonderful news," Maria said, showing the photograph attached to the letter. "Diego passed first place on the entrance exam for engineering at UCLA. Isabella graduated in nursing and got a job at UCLA Medical Center. Junior was promoted to technical supervisor at the company where he works. And your mother?" Mom wrote that sometimes she still can't believe her own life. She said that 5 years ago, when I was a cleaning lady, she cried every night thinking we would never get out of the situation we were in. Now all her children have professions. She has her own house, good health, and is even going to be a grandmother. Edward took Maria's hand and placed it on her belly. where the couple's first child was growing. "What do you think we'll name him? If it's a boy, I want to call him Gabriel, messenger of good news. If it's a girl, Hope. Why? Because that's what you brought to my life when you decided to listen to me instead of judging me. Hope that things can change, that talent can be recognized regardless of where it's born, that there are good people in the world willing to see beyond appearances." Edward kissed Maria's forehead, breathing the soft jasmine perfume she wore now, so different from the smell of poverty that used to follow her through the company corridors. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked, "about how things happened, about the time you spent being invisible?" Maria thought about the question for a long moment, observing the stars that were beginning to appear in the Los Angeles sky. "None," she said with absolute conviction. "Every difficulty taught me something important. Poverty taught me to value what really matters. The prejudice I faced taught me never to judge anyone by appearance. Invisibility taught me to observe and listen, and the time of struggle gave me strength to help other people who are going through what I went through. And now, what are your dreams now?" Maria smiled, caressing her belly where the next generation of her family was growing. "Now my dream is to raise our children in a world where competence is recognized regardless of social origin, where young people like I was can have opportunities without having to wait for miracles, and where people learn that true value has no address or last name." "That world already exists," Edward said softly. "You helped build it." 5 years later, Maria was in the same TechGlobal USA auditorium where she had once been an invisible cleaning lady, but now she was on the main stage as a guest speaker for an international conference on diversity and corporate inclusion. In the audience, she could see faces of executives from dozens of countries, all paying attention to her words about how to recognize and develop hidden talents in organizations. "I was a cleaning lady who spoke Hebrew," she began, and a respectful silence took over the auditorium. "You might think that's impossible, that people of humble origin don't have access to sophisticated knowledge. But the truth is that competence exists everywhere, in the suburbs, among the workers who clean our offices, who serve our coffee, who make the infrastructure that enables our success function." She paused, looking toward the back of the auditorium where Edward was leaning against the wall, smiling with pride. "The difference between a wasted life and a fulfilled life is often just one person willing to listen, to see beyond appearances, and to offer a genuine opportunity." In the front row, she could see Rebecca, the former receptionist who was now regional manager, carefully taking notes of every word. In the middle of the audience, she recognized Amanda, who had become human resources director and implemented inclusion policies throughout the company. "It doesn't matter what your position is, whether you're CEO or cleaning staff, manager or assistant, we all have the responsibility to recognize the hidden potential in the people around us. Because when we offer a sincere opportunity for someone to shine, we're not just changing that person's life." Maria paused, looking directly into the audience's eyes. "We're changing the world." The applause was prolonged, genuine, loaded with the kind of emotion that happens when people recognize a fundamental truth about human dignity and wasted potential. After the talk, a young woman approached Maria. She was clearly a junior employee, simple clothes, shy posture, but eyes bright with intelligence. "Dr. Maria," she said hesitantly, "I'm from the cleaning team on the 3rd floor. I study French and Italian in my spare time, just for pleasure. Do you think that maybe I could talk to someone in HR about opportunities?" Maria smiled with the same tenderness she had learned to recognize in Edward's gaze years before. "Of course you can. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to personally accompany you to that conversation." Because Maria Rodriguez had learned that when you receive a second chance, your responsibility is to ensure that other people also receive theirs. 10 years after the cold morning when a stinking cleaning lady saved a $50 million empire, Maria and Edward Anderson were in their house's garden, watching their children play. Gabriel, 7 years old, who already showed interest in mathematics like his uncle Diego, and Hope, 5 years old, who had inherited her mother's facility for languages and already spoke English, Spanish, and some words in Hebrew. "Mommy," asked Gabriel, looking up from the geometry book he was studying, "why does Grandma Carmen always cry when she tells the story of when you were a cleaning lady?" Maria exchanged a glance with Edward before answering. They had decided early on that they would tell their children the complete truth, both the difficulties and the blessings. Because sometimes, my son, people need to go through great difficulties to discover they're stronger than they imagined. And sometimes, God allows us to face prejudice and injustice so we can help other people who go through the same things. But wasn't it unfair for the other employees to complain about your smell? Asked Hope, with the brutal honesty of children. It was, Maria admitted. But they didn't know the situation I lived in. And most importantly, from that injustice came something very beautiful. I met your father, we built our family, and now we can help hundreds of other children have opportunities I didn't have at their age. Like those children who visited us last month, Gabriel asked, referring to a group of beneficiaries from the Seeds of Knowledge program who had spent a weekend at the Anderson house. Exactly. And you know what makes me happiest? It's that you two are growing up seeing that people have value regardless of where they live or how much money they have. Edward, who had been listening to the conversation in silence, approached and sat on the grass next to his family. Children, he said, your mother's story taught me the most important lesson of my life, that no matter how much success or money you have, if you don't know how to recognize the value of people around you, you're wasting the most precious opportunities life can offer. What kind of opportunities? Hope asked. The opportunity to meet extraordinary people who can make your life much richer and more meaningful, Maria replied, taking her husband's hand. Like your father gave me the opportunity to show who I really was. That night, after the children slept, Edward and Maria stayed in the garden observing the stars and planning the expansion of the Seeds of Knowledge program to other Latin American countries. Do you think our story will inspire other people? Edward asked. I hope so, Maria replied. Not because it's a perfect story, but because it's a true story about second chances, about seeing beyond appearances, and about how God can use even our difficulties to create something beautiful. And if someone asks what the main message is? Maria thought for a moment, looking at the house where her children slept safely, at the garden she had planted with her own hands, at the man who had learned to love her for who she was inside. The message is simple, she said finally. Competence has no address, dignity has no price, and sometimes, when you offer a sincere opportunity for someone to shine, you're not just changing that person's life, you're allowing them to change yours too. Edward smiled, kissing his wife's forehead, who had transformed not only his company, but his complete understanding of what makes a life truly rich. And sometimes, he added softly, the person you save ends up being the one who saves you, too. Because in the end, when Maria Rodriguez saved Edward Anderson's empire from a $50 million fraud, she didn't know she was actually saving two lives, his company and both their hearts. And that, perhaps, is the most beautiful definition of true love, when two people save each other, creating together a story that neither could have written alone. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to believe that their talents will be recognized at the right time. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever had an underestimated talent that surprised everyone when it was discovered? Your story could inspire thousands of people who feel invisible at this exact moment. Remember, competence has no address, dignity has no price, and sometimes a single opportunity offered with sincerity can transform not just two lives, but entire generations that will come after.